You're going to want to tune into this episode. Today we're going to be talking all about slumlords, landlord horror stories. If you're a landlord, it's a good one to listen to learn how not to be a slumlord. And if you're a tenant who rents from a slumlord, you're going to want to hear this on what your options are. We have a friend of our podcast, an attorney who's coming on who sues landlords professionally, who knows the ins and outs of all this, of how all this works. We have black mold, uninhabitable properties, terrible repairs that slumlords try to do to properties. You're not going to want to miss this one. The purpose of this episode is so we can help landlords and tenants come together, work well, and not have the issues that you're about to hear. Dar, welcome back to the show. Glad to have you back.
Thanks, Pierre. Appreciate you having me back.
Yeah, so maybe for the listeners who didn't hear your previous episode, maybe give a quick bio on who you are and kind of what you do, and then we'll get right into it.
Yeah, so I'm an attorney. I'm a civil litigation attorney. I have my own firm, and my practice really at the moment is focused on going after slumlords for tenant injury type related cases involving habitability. So habitability meaning anything that involves mold, lead exposure, bed bugs, rodent infestation, retaliation, anything that a landlord does against a tenant that injures them. I typically go after the slumlords.
Gotcha.
Before focusing just on the tenant side, I represented quite a few landlords and property management companies for about 5-6 years, represented insurance companies and the owners against tenants who sued them.
Yeah. I think in the interest of full disclosure for our listeners, you actually represented us on the landlord side years ago in an issue we had with a tenant, which is how you and I met each other. And then our relationship kind of grew from there. But I think you bring a unique perspective, and the unique perspective is really threefold. So one, you're a landlord. So although you sue slumlords, you're also a landlord. And I think you understand what it means to be a landlord and what some of the motivations and the risks and the things are that come with being a landlord. So that's the first thing that I really like. You have, you get it. You've walked in these shoes. And then you've spent years representing landlords, right? Because most people, coming on a podcast that clearly is, our listeners for the most part are landlords, and saying that you sue slumlords, you're probably like public enemy number one in a lot of people's eyes. Fair or unfair, irrelevant, probably. But I like to go beyond that, and it's not good or bad and landlord versus tenant. There's so much more to it. And I think from your perspective, you've represented landlords. You've seen terrible tenants. You've also seen terrible landlords. And that's why we're here today, because I want your perspective. And this is such a contentious issue, and it's political, it's personal, because, where you live is very personal for people. And lately there's bad press on both sides. And I want to basically talk about some horrible landlord stories so that our listeners can go, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to make the mistakes that those landlords made and end up in these untenable situations. So that's kind of the point of why we're getting back together. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come and help us, kind of educate some of our listeners on how all this stuff works. So kudos to you for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be here. Glad to share some experiences and stories, and hopefully help, like I said, diffuse some of these situations where landlords do get sued by tenants. So
yeah, and I want to also say that I'm very pro property rights, and for the most part, that generally means pro landlord. But I am against bad landlords. I'm against slumlords because they ruin the reputation of the good landlords and the people that are just trying to provide a service, just trying to do the right thing. We get lumped into all this negative press because there are people who don't do the right thing, who only care about, the money involved and don't care about the tenants as people, those types of things. So maybe give your viewpoint on that. Like, you've represented both parties. What's your take on that? Like, is one better than the other, or kind of what's your position on this?
Yeah, no, I think the biggest thing, like I've said, I've represented close to, or been involved, I should say, over about 1,000 cases now involving just landlord tenants, representing tenants and representing landlords. I've probably represented more landlords than I have tenants. But I think the biggest misunderstanding with landlords is that they don't treat their rental property as if it was a business. They're treating it like this is my property and I'm renting it out. And if you don't like the rules, then you can go. And I think you coined the term, well, obviously, because it's the name of your podcast. With accidental landlord is a great term. I actually use that in practice now. I categorize certain landlords as accidental landlords, where they inherit a property, or it's they're purchasing a second property and they're renting out their first property. And like I said, the biggest misconception amongst landlords who are renting properties out is that if the tenant doesn't like it, they can leave, and they forget that they're running a business. And in any business where you have somebody coming in to pay for a service or for a product, you have a heightened duty. It's a very high duty to them to make sure the property is habitable. And I joke too sometimes, because I say, even in my personal situation where I do have a rental property, I probably do more for the rental property than I do for my own personal house. And it's because I run a business. And I think that's the problem. I would say one of the common denominators in all of the landlords that I've represented and sued is that they don't understand that they are running a business. And honestly, they just don't understand the laws that tenants have when it comes to rental properties.
Yeah, I'd say, honestly, in all the episodes we've done of this podcast, the number one thing is exactly what you said, is treat your rental property like a business. And if you take emotion out of it and what you think is the right or wrong thing based on emotion, most of the problems go away. It's when landlords don't do that they get themselves into trouble. So, well, let's get into it. I want some horror stories. I want the worst of the worst. Like, what are some of the top slumlord cases you've been a part of or connected to in some way, shape, or form? Obviously, without giving names and dates and whatnot. But what are the lessons that we can teach our listeners?
Well, and I think, and let me start saying this, I don't go after just any landlord. It's really when I take a case, and I can honestly have, in a given month, maybe 30 to 50 calls from tenants who want to sue their landlords. And I may take one, maybe. Mm-hmm. And it's because the cases are hard, and I have to see that the landlord is a slumlord. They have to be a slumlord. And so the cases, and I'll give you an example of one case I had where we have somewhat of an accidental landlord. I think he inherited the property, or it was his original property. And there's a lot to this, so feel free to stop me at any point when you want to talk about something specific. But I mean, what he did was he had a front property and a back property. In the back, he had it was 2 stories. The bottom story was a rental unit, and the top floor was also a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom sort of rental unit as well. What the landlord did was he tried to create 2 properties. He essentially made an illegal ADU. He put a partition, a wall, to make it into two units. And the unit that my client was renting, the landlord installed sort of like this Mickey Mouse type bathroom. He extended it out for a bedroom. And so fine. It looked, I guess, acceptable, but obviously it was unpermitted, illegal. And so my client rented it, and it was just so many different problems with that place. And I can kind of break down some of the things that were wrong with it. First, the landlord was a professional guy. He had an advanced degree. He was in the science medical field, and he just had no idea what he was doing. And I think that every time the tenant asked for something to be repaired, he just said, I didn't have money to do it. I can't do that right now, maybe next month. And some of the issues were, we're talking massive amount of water intrusion into this place. It was water leak after water leak. So much water that the mold that grew was so bad. Imagine just you're having your baseboards and your wall painted black from just mold. But not only that, we had mushrooms, different types of fungus growing from the carpet. And so there was tons of little mushrooms in the corners of the rental property growing. And that's just the mold part, right? And then we have the plumbing issues where the toilets didn't work, and the landlord, tenant said, "Hey, the toilet's blacked up. Toilet doesn't flush. Nothing's, I need someone to come out." His response would be, "Can you go downstairs and use the downstairs toilet? for a couple of weeks until I can get somebody out there. And so, and I felt bad. I mean, and she did. She didn't know any better, and she just thought, okay, he's being a nice guy, and he's trying. But most people probably wouldn't be that relaxed with that. So those are two things that were taking place. And the thing is, the landlord just didn't have the funds or didn't care to repair anything, and he did it by himself. No management company, nothing.
So what yeah, that's it. Did he live in the front house? Was he on the property?
No, he didn't. He lived in a nice gated community out in Orange County somewhere.
Gotcha. So how does it progress from that, which is difficult to deal with as a tenant, to there's now a lawsuit involved? Like, what does that progression look like?
Right. Well, it's constant complaints, and a lot of times tenants don't know their rights. They go on Google and they try to see what they think they know. A lot of misinformation out there as far as what a tenant can do and can't do. But what happened, I think, what the breaking point was that the code enforcement at some point got involved, and because the unit was an illegal unit. So here's the crazier part. It gets even worse. What the landlord did when the code enforcement came and they said, look, this is an illegal unit if you're renting out a separate unit. So what the landlord did was when the tenant was gone, he came in, she was at work, he came in and he put in a door. He put in like a makeshift door in between the partition, so to show that it was actually one unit. And he sent her a text, say, hey, I got to install a door. Just leave it there. After it's done, I'm going to buy you a closet, and I'm going to put a closet in front of it so you don't have to worry about the door. And the door led to the next unit's living room. So the two living rooms were essentially connected. And the reason why he was trying to show the code enforcement that this is just one unit, not two. And in addition to that, he asked the tenant if she could hide her stove, or if he could hide the stove by covering it and putting it into the bedroom. And he covered it with a blanket so that he could pass the inspection. And he passed the inspection. I mean, that's a whole nother issue with the code enforcement. But
yeah, I know that doesn't sit well for the code enforcement people. Was there so the other unit with the doorway between the two was also rented, so they literally just could walk in between?
They could.
Boy.
They could.
Boy. Okay. So, all right. Yeah, keep going.
So I think that was her breaking point, the client's breaking point, and I think she then started reaching out, and once it gets to that level, and like I said when I first came on here, I try to even help landlords to this day on how to diffuse situations, and I think a lot of these cases can be diffused early on when the parties act reasonable. And obviously he's not acting reasonable. The tenant put up with a lot of stuff with the mold, the water intrusion, the mushrooms growing, and then you got also the fact that she had to use the bathroom downstairs. A couple of nights she actually slept in her car because the conditions were so bad, and she texted the landlord. So I think at some point the landlord had to, you have to act reasonable. So by the time it got to this point, I think what really upset her was that the landlord came in when she wasn't home, brought in workers to install a door, and she had all her personal items out, and she just felt violated. And then on top of that, the landlord put back her stove, almost caused a fire. Fire department had to come, and I think that was the breaking point for her. And then she reached out to a few attorneys, and I ended up taking this one because there were some good things. Obviously, we could show there's a lot of liability on the landlord, but there's also other issues that we look at in evaluating a case, and it fit perfect. So but that's how I progressed.
Yeah. How did it all wrap up? What happened in the end? Was there a trial? Was there a settlement? Like, did the insurance company get involved? What did that look like?
Yeah, and so I'll kind of explain the whole process. When a landlord gets sued, the reason why a lot of these attorneys are suing landlords are going after the insurance policies. They're not necessarily going after the landlord's personal money or assets. They know that there's insurance involved, and insurance companies, because you have an insurance policy, the insurance company will hire you a law firm to represent you against the tenant's claim. So the insurance, after several months, they finally picked up the claim. And it's funny because this is a case where the attorneys, after I had a conversation with the defense attorney and then even the insurance company, they wanted no business in litigating this case. They knew they had a loser and they knew they had problems. One of the biggest problems, and not to go off on a sidetrack, but the one of the reasons why we evaluate this case so high is because of attorney fees. And when the way attorney fees work is if a landlord tenant go out and they're in litigation, if one party prevails at trial, the other party is entitled to pay their attorney's fees back. So in other words, the loser has to pay the attorney fees back. And in this situation, typically there's two ways for an attorney fees provision to kind of come into play. It's if the lease agreement has it, or another way is what we call a statutory way, where a code enforcement comes out, cites the landlord doesn't fix it. Now, if a tenant sues, they would be able to be entitled to attorney fees. And this is more public policy and the reasons why they have it in place. But anyways, going back to this case, because we had attorney fees involved, the insurance companies knew that this was a loser. And if they went in front of a trial, or in front of a jury, in an LA County jury, they'd probably lose because, most people on that jury are probably going to be renters. And even if there are some landlords on that jury, the fact that his actions were just so out of line that they were going to find liability against him. So the case ended up settling. I mean, it settled for, high six figures. I won't say the number, but in between, $150,000 and $200,000. It's because of there was more to the case. He in addition to all this, he evicted her because of complaints. He actually told her he was selling the property, never sold it, and re-rented it.
This property is subject to the rent control laws, obviously, correct? So
Correct.
He broke those provisions of that law as
Yes.
well.
Yeah,
Okay.
because his basis for the eviction was I'm selling the property, which was that whole thing was just a whole nother element to this case, and he ended up renovating the property and then re-renting it out. Ultimately, he did sell it, but he rented it out beforehand.
Wow, I'm just taking notes here, and there's basically everything you could do wrong about being a landlord in this case. I have a ton of questions, but the one question is about the last thing you said. So he broke the rent control, the just cause law, and kicked her out, re-rented it instead of selling it. So how did that play out? Did anybody else get involved, or was it just this settlement that wrapped that all up into one bow and said, okay, this all goes away?
It was all just one. It was all one. I mean,
Okay.
They were talking, relocation fees and penalties. The biggest part were her uninhabitable claims with the water intrusion, the lack of plumbing, the fact that it was an illegal unit, and he knew that. He tried to misrepresent to the code enforcement, even though the code enforcement knew what was going on. But the misrepresentation, the fraud. There's a lot of allegations that would kind of set him up in a trial to face what they call punitive damages, basically to punish and deter such conduct. And insurance companies do not pay out for punitive damages. What that means is if you go to a trial and they say, okay, we're going to award you $100,000, but we're also going to tack on, an extra $300,000 in what we call punitive damages for just for your malicious behavior. Insurance companies, even though they have a policy that is say $500,000, they still wouldn't pay for that punitive damages. So it becomes a conflict with the insurance company and the insured or the landlord. So it pushes them to settle. So to answer your question sort of specifically, how does that play out? It really forces settlement faster because they want no business with those RSO laws, and they don't want any of that stuff. So.
Gotcha. Did he have a landlord or a policy in place, or was this just a regular homeowner's policy?
This was a homeowner policy, and so it was enough to settle the case. But it did take a while before the insurance company picked it up because it was just a regular homeowner policy. He didn't have any special policy in place for landlords and renters. But the insurance company did end up taking the case and picking up the case, I should say, and they settled within the policy.
Let's talk about that. So, could they have been within their rights to say, no, we're not taking this because this is not a landlord policy?
They can. What they do is the insurance companies will send out something called a reservation of rights letter, and they'll say that our policy doesn't cover this sort of claim that the plaintiff attorneys are making. A lot of times, the insurance policies do not cover things like mold or toxins like lead or things like that. The problem is that if insurance companies are very hesitant not to take a claim, because if they don't take a claim and then the landlord has to pay out of pocket to either settle or in a verdict in a trial, the landlord can come back and sue the insurance company for bad faith and said, I have insurance. This policy should have covered it. You guys didn't cover it in bad faith. And now the insurance company is going to have to probably pay out way more than what the case initially settled or what there was a judgment for. So insurance companies typically will pick up the case, even with the homeowner policy, but it's not always the case. And sometimes, and this is what I always tell my landlord friends, look at your policy. And if there is a habitability exclusion, then you're done. You're screwed. The insurance company can deny you. And if a tenant is suing you for habitability claims, you're going to pay out of pocket. And that I have represented landlords, that had no insurance because their insurance company had a habitability exclusion.
Where they ended up having to settle out of pocket?
Yeah. They had to pay the legal costs, the legal fees, and the settlement.
Yeah. Crazy. I'm seeing that habitability exclusion more and more. In fact, what you just described with this case is similar to what happened with the case that we were involved in. Is the insurance company initially denied, then picked it up and went down that whole path. But that's interesting insider information about how insurance companies work, because I don't think anybody really likes insurance companies, but it's good to know that when push comes to shove, not out of doing the right thing, but out of the fear of their own litigation, they'll pick it up and maybe do something with it. But let's unpack this one. So the couple things come into mind here. What are the tenant's rights if you have an illegal unit, which, by the way, is very common because we won't manage. We always ask, and if something's weird, we'll check the permits with the city. Like, is this a permitted rental unit? And if it's not, we say no, we're not interested. So it's more common than one would think. What are the rights that a tenant has if they find out that they've been living in an illegal unit?
Yeah, it's very common. In fact, I get a lot of calls on this. And one thing I do want to look at is if it's an illegal unit. And going back to insurance really quick, the insurance companies will not defend if it's an illegal unit. So when we draft a lawsuit against the landlord and knowing that there's an illegal unit, we have to craft it so that it's not just about the illegal unit, so that we could trigger the policy. We could we could say other things, but it's very, very common. In fact, I have a few cases involving illegal units. I think for a tenant, what a tenant can do, if the unit is illegal, one of the biggest thing that comes in is that the landlord is going to have a very hard time to file unlawful detainer or an eviction against a tenant where the unit is illegal. They're going to have to come in and bring it up to code before they can start the eviction process. So what I tell tenants if in a situation like this is to call code enforcement. And once code enforcement comes out, then they're going to cite the landlord. And the landlord has to now go in there and fix it. Or they can try, what a lot of landlords do now is they just say that they are going to destroy the property and they go that route. So the number one thing is getting code enforcement involved. It's a neutral that comes in and it can document and place the landlord on notice of the issues going on. So that's how I typically tell tenants to handle it.
Can a tenant stop paying rent legally if it's an illegal unit?
No, and that's another big misconception with withholding rent. A huge thing I hear a lot is from people who call me and tenants that I can stop paying rent if something is wrong with the property. If the plumbing doesn't work, I can withhold $2,500 in rent, and you can't do that. I mean, technically you can stop paying rent, but the landlord is not stopped from going and filing an unlawful detainer against you. At the end of the day, you're going to have to show, you the tenant are going to have to show that the amount you withheld was reasonable. compared to what the problem was, fixing a toilet, whatever it is. And so a lot of tenants think that it stops the landlord from filing an unlawful detainer, and that's not true. They can start the unlawful detainer process. And once they do, 99% of all unlawful detainer cases will settle, and it involves the tenant moving out at some point. So the tenant's going to lose if they try to do that, because you have to show that to a jury that you withholding $2,500 rent because your toilet didn't work was reasonable.
Yeah, which no one will ever agree to. What about the fact that it's unpermitted, though? That doesn't give you the right to stop paying the rent.
No, there's a lot of gray areas here, but the simple answer is no, because the property still has some value. It has value. You can't just live there without paying anything. There are going to be problems when it comes to kicking them out in an eviction process, but there are other means to get to have a remedy for you living in an unpermitted property. But the short answer is no. You can't just stop paying rent.
Gotcha. So if I'm looking at all the issues that I identified just in hearing the story, it's one, it's an unpermitted unit. Two, repairs not made regarding water and mold. Illegal entry, right? You can't just barge into someone's house and start doing repairs. Poor workmanship, right? So this person, if he was doing the work on the stove and almost burned down his house, that also is an issue. I know, in fact, let's talk about that. I had another insurance broker or an insurance broker on the show a while back, and he was saying that if a landlord or what they call volunteer labor, say the tenant decides to work on the property or a friend or something, does work that actually requires the license, that's a way that the insurance company will deny the claim as well. Do you know anything about that? Or
yeah, I do. I think you're talking about unpermitted or having unlicensed persons coming in and doing work when you have to have a license for that special work. Yeah, but I don't know if there's a lot of things that are going to trigger insurance not to pick up. But like you said, there's a lot of other things that are going to twist the insurance company's arms to pay or to pick it up because of the scare of them coming back for bad faith.
Gotcha.
And so there are a lot of things that trigger what we call a reservation of rights. They're basically saying, hey, we'll pick this up for now, but if we learn more about these things that you're doing that were so illegal, we're dropping it. And we're just putting you on notice of that.
Yeah. Okay. So, that's, and then the last one was using, misapplying the laws regarding just cause eviction. So this person violated every major thing you can violate as a landlord, and hence you picked up the case and goes, this is a bad landlord. This guy is not doing the right thing. Arguably he is actually negatively impacting this tenant's ability to live and have their peaceful enjoyment, which I think is their right. So if we had to, this one's a no-brainer. Don't have an illegal unit. Fix things when they break. Don't barge into the house when you're not supposed to. Hire people that actually know how to do work so you don't burn your house down. And follow the law. Is that pretty much it in a summed up fashion? Or
yeah, I think the landlord just never acted reasonable. Never educated himself. Never went out and sought any kind of education or information on how to handle this. If a tenant has an issue with plumbing, it could have been diffused. Just send out a plumber. Literally send out a plumber. That's all you got to do. And it just didn't happen. Water leaks, you got to send out somebody to address it. And whether it's a plumber, and then if you have, if your walls are filled with mold, water stains that end up growing, becoming mold. Mold grows because there is a constant water somewhere. They're feeding off water source where there's moisture or something. So you got to open the walls up. You got to dry things out. And this landlord just had no idea on what to do. He didn't hire any water restoration company. Never hired a plumber. Just took the. I wouldn't even say he tried. And that's the thing. He never even tried. And I'll tell you this, and if we can get into what I look for in evaluating a case when a tenant calls me against a landlord, it's really just, was the landlord reasonable? And if the landlord is acting reasonable, if someone says, hey, I had plumbing issues constantly, and I'm like, well, did the plumbers come out? They came out, they didn't fix it, or they couldn't fix it, or happened again, and they sent a plumber out again. it shows the landlord's trying. Maybe the first time they didn't catch something, but they're trying. I don't want a case like that. I mean, the landlord's acting reasonable. What do you want the person to do? Something goes wrong, they send somebody out. It doesn't always work out. I mean, there's another water. Like, okay, well, what did the landlord do after that? Sent somebody out. Okay. They wanted, and I had a client call me, or a potential client call me and say, well, there's water leaks and there's mold, but they're sending me to a hotel for 3 weeks and while they fix it. I'm like, sounds good to me. I mean, what do you want them to do?
Yeah.
So it's really just, when we evaluate these cases, we're looking at liability, and liability stems from, what did the landlord do? Did the landlord act as a reasonable landlord should? And that's what it comes down to. And a lot of these cases are because the landlord is intentionally just doesn't want to do it, doesn't know, and because doesn't know the laws.
Yeah. Interesting. Because you don't know something, that's a pretty legit defense against this stuff, or is that not the case?
No, you're running a business. You're taking rent money from people in California's a tenant-friendly state. We all know that. And it's because the prices are so expensive, and they got to have laws across the board that protect tenants. And I get it. And sometimes, it's supposed to help tenants, but I get there's bad on both sides. But no, you can't say I didn't know.
Yeah, no, I was being a little sarcastic, but point taken for sure. What I like about this example is this was not a large corporate landlord who literally was driving an outcome based on some spreadsheet where they were trying to reach certain financial, goals. This was an accidental landlord who just didn't know what he was doing and didn't care enough to figure it out. And this is what happens. So this is a perfect example of what we're trying to shed some light on, so people can go. I mean, none of this stuff is rocket science. Like you said, send a plumber. Yeah. Probably could have avoided most of this stuff for a couple $100. They fixed the problem. Restoration work for maybe worst case couple $1,000, and everybody moves on. Now this guy had to live through how long? Oh, this is a good question. How long, start to finish, did this take?
Yeah, these cases can take anywhere between a year to 3 years. This particular case was about a year and 4 or 5 months, and and a lot of the time we're just waiting for the insurance company to pick up the case. So once the insurance company got involved and the lawyers did some work, a solid year of work, and then it resolved.
Yeah, and I can tell you from being on the other end of one of these, that's not a fun year. Like,
no,
I would gladly trade $3,000 to not have to live through, I think ours was a couple years of just this unknown thing hanging over your head, even when you did nothing wrong, even when everything was done by the book, which was the case in the one we were involved with. But yeah, great story. What else you got? Let's hear another one.
Yeah, I mean, I have there are a lot, but one of them in particular, I think, is sort of like this one, but this one is a little more towards, not only is the property uninhabitable, it's, I've never, in my almost now 8 years of just handling landlord-tenant kind of cases, I've never seen so much mold in a property, water leaks, and we have rodent infestations, everything, right? All of it is there. Here's one it's a little sad too. I mean, the electricity was so bad in this property that the tenant, who is a mother of 4, single mom, and she reached out to the landlord about many of these issues, but one in particular was the electricity didn't work. They only had one outlet that was working in the entire property, and she sends pictures like, hey, my kids have to use a battery operated lantern to do their homework because we have no electricity in this property, no heater, none of that. And the landlord just wouldn't respond. And he took advantage of this tenant because he knew that she didn't have the financial means or the education to go out and research and learn about what her rights are. So, I mean, we're talking whenever there was rain, whenever it rained, literally the house would just flood. It was so bad. And what's even worse about it is that when she told him that there's a lot of mold, and she sent him a mold report, and she said, I have no electricity. His response wasn't to fix it, rather that she has to leave. That I want my property back. You have to leave. No notice or anything, like no proper notice. Just, hey, you got to be gone by next month. That's it. And she didn't go. And actually defeated him in 3 eviction cases. He tried to evict her. We filed a lawsuit for the habitability claims. But in addition to that, he still tried to evict her during this process. So I had to defend the eviction case. And we actually went to, he filed it 3 times. The first time we won actually in a trial because he couldn't prove certain things. The second time, he actually got a lawyer to do the eviction. And once I explained to the lawyer what happened and some of the stuff that I'm about to describe, he dropped them. And the reason why he dropped them is because what the landlord was doing now was he knew that he had to have a reason for the eviction, unlawful detainer. So what he came up with, I'm going to post that I'm going to come in to make repairs. And he never showed up. He did that 3 times. He did it 3 times. And then he posts a notice to quit because you're not complying with the lease to allow me to come in and make repairs. But what he did was he would go out on, say, like a Monday, and he would put a notice, not even on the door of the property. He would put on the tenant's car and said, I will be coming on Monday, which is the same day he's there, to make the repairs, and then he would leave. And then he realized, oh wait, I have to give them like 24 hours notice. Just want to notice. So what he did was he filed that with the court, but he changed the Monday to Tuesday, meaning he was trying to tell them, I came on Monday to come in on Tuesday, and you never let me in. He did that 3 times. So as soon as the lawyer figured that out, he dropped them, and now he has a 3rd lawyer. And but just, I mean, this guy is the definition of a slumlord. I mean, literally just collecting rent, making no repairs, not one single invoice does he have, receipt, or anything to show he actually made repairs. And then when the tenant complains, he tries to evict, and he does it in a fraudulent way. And so that one is a case that I said, yeah, I'll take this.
And this is just an individual landlord, or what? It's not like a company, or what is?
Yeah, this is just an individual landlord.
Gotcha.
Owns a property, a rental property, and that's the extent I know of him. He lives in a large, nice house, but his rental property, decent small little rental property out in the San Bernardino area. But again, this is a landlord that I categorize as they take advantage of certain people, and I think he looked at them and knew who they were and said, I could take advantage. They're not going to do anything to me. And until, again, it just takes, it got to the point where it could have been handled if he acted reasonable, but it got to the point where, like the last case I just described, something happened, something triggered them to go talk to a friend, to go online and Google. I think she got my information at church. Someone just knew me. And so it didn't have to get to that point, but it got to that point because she was just fed up.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, people can only take so much, right? I think by and large, people are reasonable. But if you deal with someone who's unreasonable over and over and over and over again, they push you beyond your limit, you're going to react. And frankly, I don't fault a tenant who wants to go after a slumlord, because slumlords aren't good for anybody. I mean,
yeah,
they're clearly ruining the reputation of landlords. Like all this hate that goes on online between landlords and tenants, it stems from bad landlords. And bad tenants do. Tenants aren't perfect themselves, but if all the landlords were reasonable and doing what they were supposed to do, we wouldn't have tenants like going ballistic and hating on landlords. It just wouldn't be the case. But this is a perfect example of who's not. So what's the moral of this story? This one seems pretty. So here, before you answer that, I want you to bring something that's so complex that someone couldn't figure out the right way to maneuver through this. And I just don't think that's reality, right? Like most of these things are simple. Just is that an accurate representation, or?
Yeah, it is. Like I said, the common denominator is acting reasonable, and that's it. If a tenant makes a complaint and you have to respond, that's it. I mean, some things can get complicated. They do get complicated. Situations where there is a water leak, the place floods, and the tenants what happens with the tenant calls their renter's insurance, says, hey, there's a flood. The renter's insurance, the tenant's saying, I need a place to relocate. The tenant's insurance company, the renter's insurance says, well, that's on the landlord's negligence. We're going to deny it, which they always deny. And then the question becomes, well, does the landlord have to come in and now provide housing for them? Who's responsible? So things can get complicated. And then you throw in sometimes an HOA in the mix and it gets very complicated. Not that you can't figure out, though. Again, the moral of both of these stories really is just to act reasonable. The reason why landlords get sued is not because the tenant hates the landlord. That's not the case. It just gets to the point where you can only take so much, and the tenant, is in these situations were good tenants. They were good people. And in fact, the last one they were paying during COVID, they were paying all their rent. And so, but yeah, it's just to act reasonable, educate yourself, learn about the laws. And if you can't handle it, hire someone to do it for you. It's that's sort of my take on it. In fact, like I said, I have a rental property and I want a management company to handle. I don't want to deal with that. I don't have time for that.
Yeah. I mean, well, let me talk to that. I mean, ultimately, a management company provides leverage. Are they going to do it exactly as you would? I mean, I would consider you a highly educated landlord for obvious reasons, but you yourself are like, yeah, I know how to do this, but this is not the best use of my time. I'm an attorney and I make X per hour as an attorney. Why on earth would I go do property management work that probably averaged out is less than minimum wage? It just doesn't make any sense. That's the part that baffles my mind sometimes, is some people get so like cheap, for lack of a better word, or they're so zoned in on how much money something's going to cost that they neglect to understand that their own time has a value. And more than likely, it doesn't pencil out that they'd be way better off going to do whatever they do professionally. You're a perfect example, than they would to fight with a tenant or call a plumber and deal with a plumber. It just doesn't make any sense. But that's one of the struggles we have.
I agree. And the thing is, honestly, I wouldn't hold myself out to be that perfect landlord. In fact, I think someone like yourself, who knows probably way more laws than I do, than in the landlord tenant area when it comes to management. And I'm being 100% truthful with that. The lawsuits I handle, whether it's on the defense side or prosecuting landlords, is, were they negligent? It's really what it comes down to. Were they negligent, and did it cause injury? So it's easy to say they were negligent when they're, toilet's not fixed. A month later, it's still not fixed. Water leaks, mold. I don't need to be an expert in. When I get the cases, the damage is already done. So in terms of how to stop it, I'm just saying be reasonable, and that's all you can really do. But what the black letter law, the ins and outs, I would say that a management company would know way more, and I really believe that. And yeah, I don't want to call, that, okay, this has to be repaired. I want to make sure that I am being reasonable. When something goes wrong, electricity goes out, or there's a leak, or there's something doesn't work, I want to make sure that I have someone there on call that can just handle it right away. And sometimes I can't do that. I think it's worth it.
I definitely didn't want this to turn into a plug for why you should hire a management company, but that is the natural progression. That's a solution to both these scenarios, right? Either you invest the time to figure out how to be a good landlord on your own, which is pretty boring, and who wants to invest a bunch of time learning about this stuff, or hire a management company. It's not rocket science. But I also don't want this to come across as self-serving, for obvious reasons, because we run a management company. But,
And I've sued plenty of management companies too. There are some, they get tossed in there sometimes. So but no, it's just it's the reality. It's while it is I guess not easy. It's doable. You can manage a property, but why would you want to sometimes? It's too much to learn.
There's no barrier to entry. You don't need any specialized training. You don't need any degrees. Like, all you have to do is have a rental property and you can manage it on your own, which I'm not advocating for more regulation of our industry, but that's why we end up in situations like this, where you have these people making terrible decisions because they own the property, type of a thing. So what, any other examples, maybe non-habitability? I know that that's pretty much the focus of your practice, so that might be a difficult one for you, but any other scenarios that you can think of?
I mean, in terms of the non-habitability issues, the cases that I have, there's always some kind of level of habitability, but I mean, there are cases that I've taken on where the common areas are not kept. And well, I'll break this on two things. A lot of the times, some of the cases I do get are involved where landlords just go into properties because they feel like they can just go in and out anytime. And that really, frustrates the tenants because they're violating their space. So while that's not a habitability issue, it's something that we consider when evaluating a case. Another type of area that I see, it's not on the rise, but it's out there, is common areas of properties that aren't kept. And this has to do with more apartment complexes, duplexes, like stairways, stairs, stair railings, things like that are unkept, and a tenant injures themselves because of that. So I've been involved in cases where tenants have fell down stairs because of faulty stairs. Really, it's faulty stairways, stair rails. So while they're not habitability type issues, they're still something that landlords forget to kind of address.
Are those more cut and dry because they either did or didn't repair it and maintain it? Like, do you still have to prove the reason? Does it still have to be reasonable? Do you still have to go through all of the rigmarole related to that, or is it more cut and dry when it's like that?
You still got to prove it. Still got to prove that the landlord had notice of these issues. So going back to even habitability, all of this stuff is, did the landlord act reasonable when they were put on notice? And did they have any notice that this thing was broken, or this didn't work, or there was water coming in, or the stairs didn't work, whatever it is. So you still got to prove notice. Yeah, you still have to prove that the landlord knew about this issue and still failed to address it.
Gotcha. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I kind of wanted to reserve the end of the episode to talk about lessons learned, but I feel like we kind of already beat that one up pretty good. I mean, the lesson is clear. Like, be reasonable, fix things when they break, and, don't enter into properties whenever you want. I mean, that's obviously a quick little summary, but anything you want to speak to, if you could speak to people who are like going down this path of wanting to be a landlord and not quite sure, or like what advice would you give?
Yeah, I think the landlords, people out there who are landlords, they need to understand the laws, what it means to have a habitable unit. And you could actually Google it. I mean, I think it's California Civil Code 1941, where it lays out what constitutes an uninhabitable property, lack of plumbing, electricity, things like that. You can read heating. And I think as a landlord, it's good to know what constitutes an uninhabitable dwelling. And in addition to that, I think one thing we didn't really talk about either, it was retaliation. And I think that when a tenant complains, a lot of landlords that I am involved in, they retaliate. And there is laws against that for the retaliation. Same civil codes out there that they say, when a landlord makes a complaint, when a tenant makes a complaint and a landlord comes back and either raises rent, or they reduce some type of amenity, or they do something in response to that, there's a presumption that you are retaliating against the tenant if it happens within 180 days. So if tenant complains, hey, I got water coming to my property, next week you send out a rent increase. While it may not be related, it can come off as retaliatory. So just be careful with that. And then
that's news to me. So 180, so 6 months, they say anything outside of 6 months, then it's no longer presumed to be retaliatory. Is that?
Presumed, but it could be rebutted. You could say, hey, look, we raise the rent every year at this time, whatever it is.
Gotcha.
But sometimes you have a situation where they complain about something and then immediately they say, hey, we're ending your tenancy. It's presumed retaliatory. Now it's on them to show that it wasn't retaliatory. So I think those are some things that a lot of landlords do because they're angry, because they don't understand the laws. And I think one of the big issues is in landlord-tenant, especially if you're a landlord, are attorney fees. And look, when I evaluate a case, whether on the defense side or for a tenant, first thing I look at is, are there attorney fees at play? Can the parties get attorney fees if one of them wins? And like I kind of mentioned, there's two ways to get that. One way is statutory, meaning the laws out there say if a tenant complains to a code enforcement cites you, and you don't fix the repairs that the code enforcement has laid out within X amount of days, usually it's 30 days, but they'll give you extensions, then if a tenant has to sue you because of that, they're entitled to attorney fees, and that drives up value of the cases.
Does that trump the lease if the lease limits attorney fees?
Good point. Because the second way is contractually through the lease agreement. Now, if the lease agreement caps it at, like, say, $500. Well, first, let me backtrack for people that don't understand what I'm talking about. In the lease agreement, sometimes it says if a party prevails at trial, the prevailing party is entitled to attorney fees, meaning if a tenant goes and wins $10 at trial, but it costs the attorneys $80,000 put on a trial, that landlord is going to have to, in a sense, pay $80,005 because of that attorney fees provision. Now, landlords got smart and they put a cap, $500, and they limited it. Now, your question was, does it trump the lease agreement? No, it's a whole nother way of getting it. So if you got that cap on your lease agreement, great, but don't blow the statutory one. If code enforcement comes out, you better react, because if you blow that, now forget what the lease agreement says.
Gotcha. So lesson here is you better take it serious if they call the city on you and they cite
Absolutely.
you for something.
Yeah, that's one of the things I tell tenants. Like, if call the city, have them document it. You could email the landlord all you want, but call the city, have code enforcement go out there, because they're supposed to be a neutral and they're going to document it very well.
Yeah.
So
how does insurance view retaliation? Does that affect the insurance policy at all, or?
They don't cover it. They don't cover it. So the insurance companies don't cover intentional behavior. It's just against public policy, because if I have insurance, I could just go out and be a slumlord and do, bad things. And if I get, a lawsuit against me with punitive damages and retaliation, all this stuff, insurance companies won't cover it. Again, they will end up paying because they're scared, because they can pay under the negligence claim. But the other stuff that's in there, it just adds value to the case. So a case that settles six figures that probably is worth maybe $10,000, the reason why is because insurance companies are scared that if they go to a trial, they're going to lose. The landlord is going to lose at a trial. That's what drives the value of these cases.
Do you think the system is broken, like the whole insurance industry and how this works? It doesn't make any sense. Like, it's totally backwards in my mind. Like, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I have a viewpoint on this, that a lot of people say, you know what, it's these plaintiff lawyers who go out and sue, who are driving insurance rates to go up and making us get insurance. But in reality, that's not true. The defense firms who are representing the business owners, they're happy about the lawsuit. When I file a lawsuit and I'm going against a defense attorney, their bills are being paid by the insurance company. So they're representing the insured, but they're getting paid as well. So, and more importantly, the insurance companies, in my opinion, need lawsuits to scare people into getting more insurance. Insurance drives the country. Yeah. I mean, without insurance, they're not making money. And so they need lawyers to sue so that, I'm a landlord, I better get that $1 million policy. I better get an umbrella policy, renter's insurance.
I never looked at it from that angle. That's actually, that's a great point. Like, they like the lawsuits. It scares people into paying them thousands of dollars in premiums every year.
They need it. I mean, in a sense, they need it. And it's so it makes it all work. And a lot of people just have a negative impact of the lawyers who sue. But then there's the defense lawyers are being rich off of insurance money, and then premiums go up. And so, but anyways, yeah. So do I think it's broken? I still think we in this country have the best system in terms of how we handle civil litigation, and it's because of insurance. When someone's wronged, they have the means to be corrected, remedied. But of course, across the board, people take advantage of it, and it's unfair sometimes.
Yeah. I think where my distaste of insurance companies is when they deny claims. But I mean, for the most part, the insurance company is way more astute than the people they're selling the premiums to, and they've worded those contracts in their favor for sure. And it's not like you as the insured can change the contract. Like you're not going to negotiate a different policy, not at our level anyway. Maybe if you're like talking about some specialty insurance policies, but yeah. Anyway, very interesting perspective.
Okay.
I appreciate you sharing that because from obviously you're in a role now that gets a little bit of hate on insurance and why you guys are driving up premiums, and you're no different than the people the attorneys defending the insurance company. They're on the till as well, right? They're just as happy because they're collecting as well.
They want a new file. I mean, I remember I had a boss that said, okay, we got a new case. Here you go. Call the plaintiff attorney and tell him thanks for the business and let's get started at 2 years of litigation. So
that is, yeah, that's wild. Yeah. I never really thought of it that way. I mean, there's people, you've heard the jokes about divorces, like the attorneys make out. They love divorce fights, right? Because they're just collecting the whole time. But anyhow, Dar, if our listeners want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I could put in my information, email, Instagram, even my phone number.
We'll link all your stuff. But you're actively open to having conversations and taking clients on and whatnot?
Yeah, and like I said, I'm predominantly tenant, but at this point, I mean, I still help a lot of landlords out. So if any landlord has any questions or wants to do the right thing and has some questions, I'm happy. I always take consultations, free consultations. Any landlord out there that wants help, that wants to understand what they should and shouldn't do, I'm happy to help to the capacity I can. And same with tenants. Like I said, the idea is to diffuse the situation so it doesn't get to the point where we litigate.
Yeah, and I personally vouch for you and your services because we've known each other for a handful of years now, and you do the right thing. I think in my mind, you hear these like tenant lawyers, and they're just looking for any little angle that they can nail a landlord. It's just not reality because it's so difficult to do. So, yeah, I appreciate you coming on, all the work you do. Ideally, if you're open to it, we'll do this again, and I want to flip the script a little and talk about some horror stories related to tenants. Because we're trying to be balanced here. We're literally in the middle of these two parties, and I want to help people understand that there's bad landlords just like there's bad tenants. And if we can figure out how to deal with bad tenants, that's going to be better for everyone. And if we can figure out how to deal with bad landlords, same thing. So it's an interesting spot. We had one of our podcasts get a whole lot of activity on YouTube the other day, and there was so much hate between the landlords and tenants. It was so disappointing to see that people just had these feelings about each other that, I'm sure came from somewhere, but in my mind, it's just so unnecessary. So it's not productive. So.
Right. No, I'm happy to come back on and talk about tenant horror stories and what the tenants have done to really good landlords. And I'm happy to discuss that side as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Dar. Appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it.
Okay, that was great information. There's stuff I learned in there that I didn't know, which, we're always on a journey of learning. But I think there were some themes, and I'm sure you guys saw them just as much as I did, that are very basic and very simple. And it's more on the preventative side of this. Like, just do these things to prevent that lawsuit from happening, because you really have to do pretty egregious things to get somebody to actually spend time out of their day contacting an attorney, because it's not easy to go through all that rigmarole in getting a lawsuit spun up. But they were, the lessons from my position were, if something's broken, fix it. Like, that's number one. And I'm happy to say that obviously we have a management company. We work with hundreds of landlords, and 99.9% of them are happy to fix things when they break. It's the right thing to do. It's also your legal obligation as a landlord. So that's, probably the first thing. The second thing is, don't rent out an illegal unit. This is more common than you think. There are plenty of people who have unpermitted, or what we call illegal, rental units, and it puts you in a really bad spot. A lot of the laws they're passing regarding ADUs are geared towards getting people who have these illegal units up to code and making it easy for them. There are certain circumstances where it's extremely easy to do. There are other circumstances where they want to make you jump through a bunch of hoops. Not the point of this conversation, but if you have an illegal unit, do what you can to make it legal. And if you can't, then don't rent it out. It's not worth it. The other thing on here that I thought was pretty clear is illegal entry. You can't just show up to your rental, knock on the door, and walk in through the front door. That's not how it works. There's laws in place. There's notice requirements. You have to post notice. You can only enter for certain things. You can't just enter because you want to go take a look. The leases are usually very clear about what is a permissible entry and what isn't. That's the other thing. So don't rent an illegal unit out. Fix things when they are broken. Don't enter the property illegally. And then that particular one where he said the one slumlord was trying to move the stove around and almost started a fire, hire qualified people to do work. If you don't know what you're doing with electrical, plumbing, any of the trades, don't try to do it yourself. If you're on your own house and you're trying to do something on your own house, go for it. But if it's a rental property, you have liability. If you make a mistake and your house burns down and your tenant dies, hopefully that would never happen, but it's happened. There's going to be some liability there, and you don't want to be in those situations where that happens to you. And then the other thing is, don't try to skirt the laws with unlawful evictions. The laws are there for a reason. Whether we agree with them or not is irrelevant. Follow the law. It's not going to get better if you don't follow the law. And then the last thing I thought was very interesting is how insurance companies work, and how the insurance company is equally afraid of their insured that they're going to sue them for bad faith. That actually is in our best interest as landlords. That's a good thing for us because we want the insurance companies to pick up the claims when the claims are made, even when the thing is expressly prohibited, like mold. Almost all policies prohibit mold, but it doesn't mean that they're not going to pick it up for fear of some other portion of it, which is very similar to what happened in the lawsuit that we were involved in. By the way, if you're ever interested in learning more about the lawsuit we were involved in, we did a YouTube video with Meet Kevin. In fact, I'll make sure we link it down below. I don't know if it's still up or not on Meet Kevin's site. That goes over some of the details related to that, which is extremely interesting, and there's some lessons to be learned there. Thank you guys for tuning in. This was a long episode. If you made it to the end, thank you. If you know anybody, or hopefully you're not a slumlord, or if you know somebody who is, send this to them. The risks are just far outweigh any potential benefits of not repairing things and doing some of the things that we already talked about. So thank you. Please like, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, and until next time, thank you.